right. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm going to question Mark Seifter today. And this is Ronald, the rules lawyer, and I'm really excited about this interview because I've watched a number of talks by Mark in the past. He is one of the leads in making the design of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, together with, correct me if I'm wrong, Jason Bullman, Stephen Radley McFarland, and Logan Bonner.
That's it. Those are the we were the team, the four leads on Pathfinder 2nd Edition.
Yeah, and if there's any audio issues, please tell me in chat. I can't hear what you guys hear. And I have been a big fan and advocate of the system, and there's been and also an active participant in the subreddit for Pathfinder 2E, where we analyze, gush, criticize the design, and I've been a real fan of what Pathfinder 2E innovates as a relatively new system in the scene. And I was really excited to talk to one of the people in the inner circle who was behind the thoughts, decisions behind the system. So, okay, so some overall rules. This is not a no one's under oath here.
Is it a cross-examination or a deposition?
It is an interview, and
okay.
I've been accused of clickbait recently, and I'll confess this is on on the edge of possibly being clickbait. But I looked up interrogation in the dictionary and said to ask questions, particularly in a hostile way. So it does not preclude a friendly question.
There you go. You can ask me questions in a hostile way, particularly.
That'll get more clicks and views and maybe cause a storm on Twitter, but I'm not that cheap. I'm hoping that the quality of the questions and answers will speak for itself.
So, instead of asking, like, why did you decide to make 12 classes, you could be like, why were you foolish enough to decide to make 12 classes?
Yeah, and,
Permission to treat the lawyer as hostile?
I would object to myself in that instance.
Okay.
The overall goal today, I'm going to kind of say the overall plan I have, and we set out 2 hours for this because I sent a set of preliminary questions to Mark, and he was like, it was like 15 questions, and you were saying you could spend an hour on one of these questions.
If I picked the right ones, yes. And I said, you sent me 15 questions, said it was 2 hours, and I said, we will not complete them, because they're going to take at least an average of 10 minutes per question, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And 10 times 15 has been known to be over 120.
Oh, someone's asking if I can enable automated closed captions. Let me see if I can.
Oh, can you?
There's this switch I can turn on, but it's not letting me turn it on, unfortunately. I apologize. I'm in the YouTube settings right now, and I'm trying to turn it on. I cannot. It's not letting me click it. Galarian in Depth says it's not hostile. You're not a hostile witness, or it's not hostile questioning if you have nothing to hide. Okay, what I'm going to go over...
Well, you know what? I refuse to answer on the grounds that might incriminate myself.
Yeah, and we were joking before going live that this wouldn't really be a fair process anyway, since you're not represented by counsel. And
and I said that means that I have a fool for a client, because I guess I'm my own lawyer here.
I assume Steve knows what you're doing.
I told him.
Mm. Okay, so the overall outline for today is I wanted to kind of pick your mind about, first of all, what got you into gaming overall. And all kinds of games, not just tabletop role-playing games.
That's the first thing I ask when I'm interviewing someone on my channel, so I approve.
Great minds, right? Or maybe you think like a lawyer.
Maybe it means I think like a rules lawyer. I mean, being on the Paizo design team is kind of like being on the rules Supreme Court.
Yeah, that's true. Then I was going to go into the design goals for Pathfinder 2E, why those were chosen, and how those were met. Now, that is very vague, open-ended. It could be a lot of things, but I had a lot of, things I wanted to hone in on in detail as well. And there was someone who tweeted, Matthias, the GM, just an hour ago, and it was really appropriate for this interview today. He asked, what are the defining features and mechanics of Pathfinder 2E that make it great, in your opinion? And I just listed the 4 things I wanted to deep dive into in my interview today, which were the 4 degrees of success system, the 3 action economy, the encounter building system working, and what I will call, maybe I'm coining a term right now, horizontal character growth instead of vertical. So those were 4 things I wanted to cover. Now, I mentioned that we're not going to have time to go through everything I wanted to today, so people can super chat and leave tips, but I cannot guarantee the question will be asked, because I think the greater good will be to go through as much of what I had planned as possible. I'll try to manage time as much as I can. But we also accept tips of any kind, and there's a special animation thanking you for that. Also, Roll for Combat has a great podcast and also a YouTube channel. So I put some links, I believe, in my video description. So let me see what chat is saying so far.
Looks like they said hubris.
Oh, that is an always wondered question. I'm going to note that down. Ooh, good question, Jerome Mitchell, but I'm not going to ask it right now.
If you ask me a rules adjudication question, I won't answer it.
Oh no, there's a new super chat. Oh, there's a super chat. Okay, I'm gonna put it on the list. It will be asked today because it is a burning question mark, and it's not going to be an official ruling. I understand that you don't have foundation to speak on behalf of Paizo.
Or it's not even that. Like, in a lot of cases, I know relatively, I have a good sense of what it is, but it's not an official answer. Even if I was still at Paizo, it isn't. And mainly, I've been burned in the past, and so have a lot of people you do it, and then it gets used as a cudgel to kind of beat on people on the internet.
Yeah, and we don't want people to beat up.
And I don't really want to see that, so I tend to not give authoritative answers. Just figure out what works for your group, and when we get to that one, I'll talk about that.
Okay, and okay, good. All right. So yeah, tell me, who is Mark Seifter? Why did he get into gaming? And I also noted that you you did computer programming as your major in college?
So my major is computer science. Technically, it's computer science and engineering is the degree that's on my master's from MIT, which is a specific subcategory of the ECS department where you did not want to build actual circuits and wanted to do as much computer program essentially as possible. My focus was in artificial intelligence and sort of the way that humans and possibly machines could think based on learning from stories and that kind of thing. So it's less disconnected than you might think from being an RPG designer, but RPG designers have very diverse backgrounds. I worked with an architect, a philosophy major, and an art major, and replaced a chemical engineering major on the team that I was on at Paizo. So,
I mean, RPGs by their nature are kind of all-encompassing, I think. And what you just said about artificial intelligence responding to stories sounded very because we create rules for something that is by nature a story. In people's imaginations, it's hard to kind of quantify everything, and I had a big explosive sound from my computer of something. Thank you, whoever you are. I missed it. I'm sorry. Okay.
Kaboom!
So
I didn't hear it on my end. So.
Are you watching? Or are you listening to the stream?
No, I'm not.
On
So that's why
YouTube?
it,
Oh,
it,
okay.
it didn't come through your microphone, at least,
Okay,
even if it
good.
came through your computer.
Okay, someone says lower the volume of the subscribe notification. It is too
Oh, it's the
loud.
subscribe notification. There you go.
Yeah. Here we go.
Curse you, subscribers. No, just kidding.
Thank you, subscribers.
Thank you, subscribers.
I am okay learning. I assume I do this in what is feeding stream elements into my computer. Well, I'm sorry, but this interrogation's now becoming learn stream elements with the rules lawyer.
There you go. You're interrogating stream elements. That's it. I'm unsubscribing.
Okay, whatever it will take to heighten the quality of our content, I say. It must be in Stream Elements itself. There's mute audio in the editor. No, that's not what I want. Notifications. It's court procedure. Alert box. It must be under alert box. Huh. Okay, I'm gonna lower it by 50%. Or no, 30%. Let's see. But I have to lower 5 different things. Okay. So let's test this. Let's see how it sounds. Oh, that was too loud too.
Oh, that made a loud sound.
Yeah.
That I actually did hear that time.
Okay.
Objection, badgering the witness with explosions.
Okay, do I have to click save somewhere? Oh, this is
Whoa!
way too loud. I lowered it to... What if I lower it to 0%? Is this even effectable? This is a... member alert.
I can do like a Star Trek ship crew shaking in the room, reaction every time.
Okay, this is not... Okay, stream elements, I need to... this user interface is not intuitive. What I'm going to do is...
As a game designer, I feel that you should make the user interface intuitive as possible while still keeping the necessary features.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I'm going to have to lower the system sound and then create a new audio input for Mark specifically. Okay. Discord.
I'm used to having to have my own new audio input volume for my very projecting voice. But in this case, it's just to stop the explosions. So
Yeah.
it's actually, ironically, the opposite of usual.
Okay. There's got to be a way. I know. I can right-click you and increase your user volume. Now speak, Mark.
I am now speaking.
Okay, and then I'm going to lower the system. Okay, testing, testing. Say something.
Hello.
Okay.
Hello, I'm now talking not quite as loud as when I said hello before.
All right. Okay, now let's test it. I believe that's more balanced. Maybe it's not perfect, but... Okay. All right, someone said stop doing this. Okay, I'll follow the audience. All right, we're back. So, back to my question, which was your gaming history.
Let's get back to the first question. So, my gaming history, how I started with tabletop role-playing games, it was when I was little, and I had already played, like, video games that were RPGs that I liked, and, like, a foreign relative came over and was trying to explain Dungeons and Dragons to me as a child, and he had this accent, so he was like, and there are 4 classes which are They are a wizard and a clerk and a fighter and a thief. And I was like, why do you want to play a clerk? Like,
Okay.
that doesn't seem like the other ones. It's like,
How old were you?
Pray to the gods. I was like, what?
How old were you?
Gosh, I don't remember exactly how old, but it sounded like clerk, like enough that that is what I heard, and then I started playing it, and it was in fact a cleric and not a clerk. It turned out. Mm-hmm. And so when I started playing, because that was when I first heard about it, and I started playing like a few years later, which would have been when I was in. I think I tried to play it in like late elementary school and failed because nobody would pay attention to anything, and then I managed to actually start a game that actually went on in middle school.
Okay.
So,
and which edition was this?
And that was Dungeons and Dragons. That was Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd edition.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. That's how I got started. And I was a forever GM when I started.
Yeah. And what about video games and computer games? Are you much into those?
Yeah, I definitely am. I play. I've played a lot. Like when I was little, like I said, I started by playing a lot of RPGs, and I still play a fair amount. Right now, since I'm still not getting used to the fact that I'm the director of game design at Battlezoo, so I could like have a next gen system or like buy games when they come out. I generally buy like whatever's on an 80% off sale, or like a humble bundle for like $1, because that's like the Paizo way to get games on a Paizo budget. And
okay.
I've got a lot of really good games that way.
From a few years ago,
very
right?
Enjoyable. Yeah, they're just not the ones that you're playing if you're someone who plays the ones that are out now.
Yeah.
Like, I actually feel kind of bad because I know that the designers of those games are kindred to, like, me designing games, and that their games that they put so much work into are being sold for so little, but I guess ultimately it makes them... There's an algorithm that determines that makes them more money than not putting it on the discount. So
are there a couple games that you are really into right now, or that are favorites? For me, XCOM is one of my favorites, and also I just got into Slay the Spire.
Oh, Slay the Spire. I played that a while ago. I heard they have a new class. Maybe I'll try it again. Those card-based roguelites are pretty good. There've been a lot of imitations of Slay the Spire that are also good. If you like XCOM, I've heard that there's some similarities in the sense that you have like people and they could get permanently killed when you're moving around. In Wildermyth, which is a game that Linda and I are doing sometimes on our stream, it is a kind of roguelite, but very narrative-heavy fantasy game where it has tactical combat, but you like make decisions with the characters, and they get older and develop rivalries and stuff.
Oh,
so
Wildermyth.
Might want to check that one out.
That sounds interesting.
It's pretty good. There's not anything I'm like deeply into right now. Let's see, I played Monster Sanctuary recently. That was pretty good. There are a lot of games that are like I played them recently and they were pretty good. When I was little, I was very into like the Square games, Squaresoft, which is now Square Enix, but was then Squaresoft games that were coming out at that time, which were like the old school Super Nintendo Final Fantasies and Secret of Mana and games like that. That's a lot of the... I think Secret of Mana was probably the first RPG I played at a friend's house because my parents didn't want me to have any kind of video games at our house. And I've joked before that maybe they were worried I would grow up and have a dead-end job like game designer, but they didn't even think of that at that point in time. They just thought video games rot your brain or something like that.
And what got you to work with Paizo, and when was that?
So I was sort of, at MIT, working on my PhD, and Sean K. Reynolds left Paizo as a designer. And they put out an open call for someone to take that position. At that point, like, I had done a few third-party products just because I felt like doing a few third-party products, but not very many. I had never written anything for Paizo, but I felt like I had a very strong grasp of the system and the setting. I was a volunteer for organized play, and like I knew a lot of things, so I decided I'll put my name in. They won't probably take my resume, but I know there's a test after that, and I will ace it if they give me the test. If they give me the test, I'll be in the finalists, but they probably won't give me the test. Was what I thought, and they gave me the test, and I got the highest score by a significant amount, and then they gave me the job. So
what year was this?
What happened? Oh gosh, that was around 8 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I joined in June. Yeah, it would be almost exactly 8 years ago. So the test would have been even like a little over like 8 years and a few weeks or something like that.
And when in relation to Pathfinder Unchained coming out for first edition Pathfinder, which some have called a kind of testing of ideas for second edition,
Pathfinder Unchained was my first hardcover book that I worked on pretty legitimately. I kind of am illegitimately listed in Monster Codex due to the fact that like Jason, Steven, and Logan had that book like done. But then like there was a section on goblins and it needed another stat block to copy fit. So they were like, we're doing it, but we don't have time. Can you write something? So I wrote the Goblin Sticky Lord. And that alone got my name in as a contributor with probably like the minimum amount of anything to go in there. But you do need to list someone, even if they only do a small amount. So I barely got in on like the very end of something that had been outlined, assigned, everything had been done up until then. And the book after that, being Unchained, was the first one where I was very solidly working on it. And I did a lot of work in Pathfinder Unchained.
What were some systems or subsystems or variants or things in Unchained that you found yourself working on?
I mean, my fingers were on sort of a lot of the... I would say almost everything in the book I did at least some kind of a pass on. But there were certain things that I added to the book due to the fact that, like, it was a very ambitious project. It's the kind of thing that, like, is difficult to freelance out, and that I think Paizo would, if they didn't have someone who had just left the company while they were doing, would have probably tried to do more in-house. So there was an attempt made to freelance out a certain percentage of the book, but it didn't always deliver back like exactly. It was well done, but not like exactly the thing that was being looked for, or in some cases was outlined, not realizing how hard it would be for freelancers or like how many pages it should have actually been. So when it came back, it was always like, oh, wow, this thing, actually, we gave it a lot of pages, and they figured out a way we could have done it in way fewer, and so that we had pages to fill, that we could fill. And so I came up with a bunch of ideas that wouldn't have even been in the book, which had been pre-outlined and assigned before I got in. If it weren't for the fact that the design team, even to this new person who had just joined, were all like, oh yeah, Mark, you can put that in. They were very, very great colleagues in terms of just being willing to be like, yeah, that sounds cool. If you can write it, let us check it, we'll put it right in. And so things that were in that category probably interest you the most, because the other ones are just like, did Mark do a pass on these? Yes. But things I added because I wanted to. Automatic bonus progression is one of the ones that I added because that I wanted to. Let's see. One that was added at Linda's suggestion, just because I was talking to her about
what doesn't
Linda?
work. Oh,
Linda?
Yeah, Linda. Okay.
Linda. I was talking to her about what doesn't work in Pathfinder, and she said poisons and diseases in Pathfinder first. So then I did a variant on poisons and diseases. What else? Gosh. Dynamic item creation, because Pathfinder First Edition was a huge advancement in lots of small little ways over 3.5 D&D that kind of fixed things. But the only thing it kind of broke was that when you're crafting in 3.5 D&D, you pay XP cost to craft items. And Pathfinder realized XP cost is a bad cost, which is true, and removed XP cost to add 5 times that amount in gold costs to spells and things like that. That was a great idea. But they forgot to add that to crafting, which they should have done. And because of that, they replaced it with nothing, thus making crafting blatantly overpowered. If your group had time, it just doubled how much you got. So my group...
Is this the system that led to there being quirks on magic items?
It is, yes.
Oh,
so
okay.
My
middle schoolers loved that.
And we kind of wanted something more interesting and less broken. Yeah. So dynamic item creation is the one that you probably won't get it for half, but it might have perks or quirks, and it's a more interesting process. Like in the tales and the stories, you know, like when you're talking about forging the legendary sword or the Sampo in the Kalevala, it's always a big story of how they did it. It's not just like, I went to my back of my shop and I made it and now it's done.
And was there talk, I might have, maybe I'm misremembering, I thought someone had said there was thinking in Paizo about a second edition as early as the release day of first edition. To what extent was that true?
That's always true. Because not because you're saying we're seriously going to put it out right now, but because of 2 reasons. One, all editions have a lifespan, and like first edition arguably had a longer lifespan than almost any other edition, especially if you count 3.5 as being separate from 3.0. But all editions have a lifespan. It's predictable. You should be thinking about it immediately from just like even a company perspective. But also, as designers, we always want to fix the things that we know didn't quite work the way as well as we wanted them to. And there always is, because designers are always tinkering. And if we could keep the patient open, we would constantly be revising and changing things that are probably too fundamental to actually do, or else customers would just not be able to understand the game and be very upset. So we understand that and we don't do it. But
so you put them on the cutting room
there's
floor.
Always like at launch a list of things that are like, this should go in the next edition.
I'm sure one question people will have is what is in the future for third edition? Of course, you're not in any position to speak on it.
I'm not at Paizo.
But any of those ideas, anyway.
Like, I'm not at Paizo. I don't know. Like, I will say that first to second edition kind of cut the cord of having to be compatible with 3.5, which allowed for a pretty significant shift out of things that were not being good for Pathfinder first edition, but had to be there for compatibility towards sort of being more even more unchained than Unchained. And so I would suspect that since that was removed already, that it may be the case that future editions are not as big of a shift due to the fact that they don't have to do that step of cutting off the other stuff, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that it won't be a big shift. It just means it maybe won't be as big of a shift. And I have no idea. So maybe it will. Maybe you're watching this video like in 2082 after the release of Pathfinder 10th edition, and you're saying, no, and you know how wrong Mark Seifter was about the shift not being bigger? Because that was when they added virtual alternate reality cards packs to the game or whatever. I don't know. I'm just making up.
I think looking
semi-sci-fi things.
Looking back at Unchained, it's pretty clear that there was that tinkering going on, given the kind of the freedom you had to test things out without having to actually revise the base system with Unchained. That would turn into ideas in second edition. Now I want to go to what were some of the earlier conversations about second edition and what you would try to improve over first edition, and some things you hoped it would if you could just go into that.
Well, I mean, for one thing, we had a goal that was a very overarching goal, and it's a very abstract goal, but I will try to explain it. which is when you think of like stuff that is in the game that makes the game more complex because there's things there. You kind of have two axes of complexity. You have one that I would call complexity. And that is just like, what is the barrier to entry? How much stuff do you actually have to figure out? How complicated is this? You kind of don't want that. But then there's the second one called depth, which is good generally. And it's just like, so how much is there to this? How much depth does the game have? Is it just kind of shallow and there's not very much depth? So our goal was to maximize the depth while lowering the complexity as much as possible without sacrificing depth from Pathfinder 1st Edition. If you think to Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, they had a different goal, which I feel they succeeded at, but they wound up with a different game, but they succeeded pretty well, which was to minimize the complexity and then see how much depth they could have at that point. And while still also obviously they didn't minimize it so much it became a rules light or narrative game. They still wanted a D&D style, relatively crunchy game, but with a very minimum complexity and then how much can you get the depth. So those are two different, you would say, optimization problems in computer science, right? To see what's the minimum complexity for the max depth and to see what's the maximum complexity for the minimum depth. So that was a abstract goal that we had, but we certainly had a lot of other goals as well.
And just to comment on your background, it seemed like you were able to kind of get on board with already kind of designing systems early in your work with Paizo, or proposing systems.
I mean, they knew that we were going to make Pathfinder 2nd Edition as soon as I was hired, and before, I'm sure. Like, we were already talking about certain things that could be like very, very early, kind of just pie in the sky talk. Like at the beginning, we didn't have time to do anything more than that, but we made like little concept docs. That's where I put in the 4 degrees of success as a concept doc. That was one of the harder concept docs to get past the team because of the added complexity, but I feel that it was worth it.
Okay. And so at the time you guys were coming up with a draft design for 2nd edition. 1st edition had been out some years. 4th edition D&D had been out and did a number of things with its design. And
5th came out a little bit after some of those earliest concept docs, but it was certainly out for all of like the main amount of time that we did a lot of work on it on Pathfinder 2nd.
So what were some things that you, and don't just, you don't have to limit it to Pathfinder or D&D, but also any other TTRPGs that people may have been playing, what were some cool ideas you thought that you could borrow or adapt for a 2nd edition?
Well, I mean, generally I feel like everything is filtered through the designer, who has generally played a ton of different games and is kind of hodgepodging the experiences of what worked and what didn't together. So I'm sure that every mechanic is some combination from multiple games or others. I definitely had seen something akin to the 4 degrees of success in other systems, although never done exactly the same mathematical way that I had it done for PF2, such that it would do exactly the things on the D20 that I wanted it to. But I definitely have played games with those kind of systems. Or, for instance, Stephen Rodney McFarland, who was the #1 person on getting the 3-action economy I definitely, after he proposed it, I wound up playing several like miniatures board games that I knew he liked that also had a similar kind of system in it. So I was like, oh, I can see where he may have been influenced by this game towards coming out, and that was like somewhere in the genealogy of the 3-action economy.
Who brought up those games, you or Steven?
What?
Those board games?
And this is Stephen Rodney McFarland, not my current boss, Stephen
right,
Booker,
right.
But he didn't bring up that he was doing anything with them. He just at some other point had mentioned that he liked Game X, and then at a much later time, I played Game X and was like, oh, it's not the same, but it has a pretty decently similar idea of that you get a certain number of actions and you use them to do your things.
Were there particular board games that were like that?
I think there's a lot like that. Like even
I was gonna say,
Pandemic
I
has
can
that.
hardly. Yeah, Pandemic is one of them. Yeah, but everything costs one action in Pandemic.
Yeah.
But a lot of board games, I like board games, have some kind of action point system. But I'm trying to think of ones where Pathfinder Second seems to go farther in having. Well, I know that one of the recent isometric CRPGs has had such a system, an action point system, and things having different costs. Anyway, I just
Yeah, there definitely are.
So it's
But
not-
if you mean a multi-cost, not that many board games have it. And I think Steven's initial design didn't, and like intentionally indicated for the multi-action activities like what the individual actions were. So like in the original design that he gave, for example, in spellcasting, the actions you took would be like the somatic action and the verbal action. And so therefore it would necessarily quicken a spell to remove one of the components, where it doesn't do that currently because the components are not a separate action that makes up the spell. So I think that his initial was even more similar to the board games, where it was just like, yes, there's one action and it does the one thing. Sometimes you can take a bigger thing that does more than one of them together. But the final results, I would say, has moved away from that, and it was never exactly the same, right? But designs are always, I think, inspired by just all the other games that you've played, sort of being synthesized in the designer's brain.
Okay, I'm going to shoot off my list of things that I'm going to assume Pathfinder designers kind of saw in other systems, and you tell me if how many of these things were kind of relevant or in the front of the mind or the back of the mind of designers. So you wanted to preserve first edition Pathfinder's character customization, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
And many options. Then D&D 4th edition is had. I actually haven't had direct experience with 4th edition, but I read that it had a workable encounter building system.
I played 4th edition, but not enough to say exactly how workable the encounter building system is. I certainly found it to be somewhat more accurate than 3.x Pathfinder or 5e encounter building system. So it was more accurate than those, but I wouldn't say I'm enough of an expert in it to be certain that it was fully workable. I saw some edge cases, but I only played a small amount of 4th edition.
Okay. And part of why that was true, I think, was there was a mechanism for characters to heal up between encounters in 4th edition, which is kind of has its own version in Pathfinder 2e. Then there's multi-classing, not done by adding levels of other classes, but by spending some of your feats on getting abilities from other classes. And also an effort to balance marshals and casters, an overall effort to make the game more balanced. Then with 5e, you mentioned that there was...
I would say that for those things that very few of them were inspired by the mechanics of 4e, or if anything, they would sometimes be used as a foil to determine whether or not our mechanic was workable by thinking about how that mechanic went in 4e, because Logan and Steven had experience from there. So like whenever there was a mechanic where it's like, oh yeah, there was something kind of similar to that in 4e, but the problem was it was very gamey and it didn't have any in-world explanation. We would be like, well, what if we had an in-world explanation like this? Be like, oh yeah, that might be something people like more than in that case.
Yeah.
So it could sometimes be used as a counterpoint to help us design, but it was never like 4e has this thing, so we should include it. It was more of a, what if we did something like this, and then the people with 4e experience said, oh, we have experience doing something like that. There actually
Right.
wasn't 4E, and not even everyone who was in the room knew that there was, right? It's just because you'll come up with parallel design. It's like there was something kind of similar to that in 4E. Let us tell you what did work and
Mm.
what didn't work. So we had all of the knowledge and experience from two people who had worked on 4E, but it's not like they were trying to
Yeah.
like add extra 4E things. It was more of a like they could make sure we didn't step in any pitfalls from 4E and that we did
Right.
get any advantages from it.
Right. I would say, yeah, I think that totally makes sense. And uh, Logan and Steven were, what was their role in 4E?
Um, Gosh, I don't know exactly which titles they held because I think it changed multiple times, but that they definitely both designed things for 4E, and they may have done more than that.
One thing that you had mentioned was that again, I haven't had direct experience with 4E, but I want to try it now. What actually has gotten me interested has been playing Pathfinder 2E and hearing that a number of things kind of echo what 4E accomplished. But one of the things that was I was unsure about reading through the 4E materials was there seemed to be, yeah, this seems uh, it makes sense in as a game, but maybe not to the characters in the world. And I Pathfinder 2E, I think, strikes a nice balance of accomplishing some mechanical goals. Well, what am I saying? That keeping things thematic. I'll just say that. Um, then for 5E, there is to this day they have one obvious book that pretty much covers a lot of what you can do in 5E, which is the player's handbook. You could just get the player's handbook, and you only need to make a few choices at character creations, and you don't have the barrier that in first edition Pathfinder of kind of there being a pressure to review all of the feats that you could choose from. So anyway, those were just some things that I thought Pathfinder 2E was kind of some goals, and
Mm-hmm.
and but I accept what you're
I'm not
saying
sure what
that
you were saying that it took from 5E based on that, because I feel like Pathfinder 2E does not do the thing where you have a character with very few choices that's easy to build. We definitely give you, for better or worse, we definitely
yeah.
give you a bunch of choices that might make it harder to build, but give you more customization.
Oh, but yeah, but it seems informed by the by what you said that we don't want character creation to be a barrier of entry. So you're able to in Pathfinder 2E make a lot of choices, but you're not confronted with a list of a 4-page spread of feats to choose from at level 1.
I would say that was not based on 5E. I'm confident that it wasn't. That's based on Pathfinder First Edition and some of the late stage class design, where starting with the Kineticist, but you can see it in the Vigilante as well, and some of the other ones, and the skill unlock feats and Unchained sort of, is where I kind of figured out as I was designing classes, and then the other designers explained to me part of why it worked, and I got even more in depth with it, that having all the feats be from the same resource was causing a lot of problems. Not just making it very impenetrable, but also meaning that, like, no matter how broken you made a skill feat, and, like, a feat that gives you +6 in Pathfinder First Edition to a skill is way too much. But also, nobody took it because it cost the same resource as making your archery be, like, 50% better than if you didn't have the feat. I'm talking about skill focus versus some of the mandatory archery feats. And so it was both too powerful for skills, but also untakeably bad because it took your same resource that you needed for your combat feats. So the idea came from first edition discoveries to kind of separate and silo feats into different categories so you didn't feel guilty or bad if you're someone who feels pressure to have a character be viable in combat, that you felt good about taking your skill feats and not bad of like, oh, but I should have probably taken rapid shot, but I took this skill feat to fit my character. And I would say that that is done differently than 5e does it, and is based more on that, in my opinion. Now, that being said, I don't know what went through the heads of everybody who was designing, and I definitely can tell you that when I did a very deep dive of certain things in 5e when I started this job so that I could work on the monster part system, I saw one or two things that I hadn't noticed before that I was like, oh, that thing that Steven kept trying to have Bless do is like exactly the same thing 5e does. And we didn't want it to do that because it was way too much of an effect for a first level spell. And it wasn't similar to Pathfinder First Edition, so I wasn't sure where that was coming from, for instance. And there were a few things like that where it was like, oh, okay. So I can tell you that certainly there were some ideas that I'm sure were inspired by any game, and like game design should be, but that particular one I don't think was.
Yeah. So there are people who don't try out Pathfinder First or Second Edition, saying that Feats, just the fact of Feats, makes it a character building power game, and Pathfinder 2e has lots of feats, and so I think you started to talk about it. But how did you hope to make a system that allows people to make very custom characters, but also didn't create a situation where somebody who focuses on combat power is not completely overshadowing someone else? What were some of the choices that were done in the design in order to prevent that from happening?
So one of the keys there that solved not only that problem, but also the problem that Pathfinder First Edition had, which was a huge problem, where you could sit down at the table, maybe in, say, an organized play game where, you know, you don't know who you're going to sit down with, and you come in and you're like, I brought my character. I'm a diplomat bard. I'm all good about doing the diplomacy, folks. I have maxed out charisma as much as possible. I even used point buy to get 20 at level 1. I maxed my ranks in diplomacy, and I'm level 12, and I have plus... I found an item, and I have plus 26 diplomacy. And then someone else is like, oh, nice, I have plus 52. So sit down, shut up, and I'll do the diplomacy. You can assist me.
Yeah.
And that was very possible, and in fact even likely in Pathfinder First Edition to happen. Like, I had a character who had, I think, plus 60 something on knowledge checks at like level 4 or 5. And that was just a thing that could happen in Pathfinder First Edition, where it wasn't just did you reward specialization over someone who wasn't specialized. It was two people both thought they were doing a good job specializing on their characters, and one of them was so much better than the other one that literally the D20 wasn't enough to allow one to the other one to beat the other. So that, and the question you asked about the person who puts a lot into combat or not, are both solved by making an emphasis on feats and abilities that are not just pure math boost like weapon focus in Pathfinder First Edition. For those of you watching who haven't played First Edition, that's a feat that was +1 to attack rolls. So not doing that, and instead doing feats that are more thematic and give you some cool ability that makes the characters, like you mentioned earlier, grow horizontally in their capacity, rather than winding up building bigger and bigger in specialization. That, combined with bonuses that did not allow untyped bonuses that could just go on top of any other bonuses. They literally cannot be added to Pathfinder 2nd Edition. The rules specifically state that only untyped penalties exist. And having limits on what types of bonuses there can be, such that they overlap and are not cumulative, means that you never are going to sit... If your character is legendary in diplomacy and has like the max charisma, you're never going to sit down with someone who absolutely makes you a laughingstock in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. It's impossible. Maybe if you forgot to get an item and they have one, they'll be like a little tiny bit better than you in the number. And they might have different feats than you that let them like get an audience with the king or something like that, or like shamelessly ask people for something. But and that'll make it feel like the person who did spend more feats is a little more into it, but you're never like disengaged because their bonus is just so much higher than yours that you're just actually a liability trying to attempt it.
Yeah, I think you are. Is there more? I think you should keep talking, but also I
Okay,
don't want to
yeah,
fill in
sure.
the space.
Kind of it's kind of all about that.
Yeah.
The problem with math boosters like weapon focus in Pathfinder First Edition, it's a very insidious problem. Is so in game design, the holy grail in game design is as a game designer, what I want to make the most, absolute most out of a feat or any new abilities. I want to give you something that you think is too powerful or very, very powerful, maybe even overpowered, but that I know is not and is actually balanced and is going to do well in the system. That's great. Where you feel very powerful, but it's fine. The absolute, whatever the fake grails that you drink in Indiana Jones and turn into a skeleton, is something like weapon focus in Pathfinder First Edition, where anybody except the people who crunch numbers like me just are like +1. 1 is a very small number. That sounds boring. This is like the most boring thing. I don't want to take that. But that it's actually secretly incredibly powerful. So that it's like the reverse the evil unholy anti-grail that you and so by virtue of having a system that didn't have those, where and you know there's other ways you can try to get around that, but it winds up doing things that can cause other problems. You can be like, well then fine, we'll give you +2. Now it sounds good, right? Or +4. And then it's like it's even more bustedly strong. People do think it's strong at that point, but you've like four even in First Edition is so wildly high that you've thrown everything off when you give a feat that gives someone +4 on all of their main thing.
One thing that's kind of I noticed when I first looked at the Pathfinder core rulebook is that a lot of the things that used to be feats that you had to choose that were kind of mandatory for a martial character now are just in the basic class progression, like weapon specialization being an example.
Yeah,
Or
so anything that's those math boosters that are expected, they're just going to be in your chassis. I talked about this in the Arcane Mark What If episode, where we talked about certain things that were proposed at least once at a meeting in Pathfinder 2nd Edition that we did not do. And the one that was perhaps the most problematic of all of the ones that I suggested was the everything is a feat. And there are no features. And for exactly the reason you said is why we switched off of it, and the reason I just said about the anti-holy evil grails, is because there were ones in there that were just like the fighter's current thing, where at level 5 they get expert master in weapons, was just like, that was just a feat. And so of course it was the best feat, because of course it is. You see people talking about fighters even now mainly because of that. And so, but people who are new players might not know that, and they might just make a worse fighter. It looks less attractive than the other feats at its level 2. So the key to do that, which you solved, I guess, you figured it out. That's how you deal with anti-grails. You make them automatic. Because no one wants to take them, but they're actually the best. So if they happen automatically, then that's fine. No one minds, because it's like, okay, I get this, it's free. But if you make people pay for it, they wind up grumbling sometimes, unless they do the math about it being unattractive choice. But it winds up actually being too strong compared to the other choices.
And then you have feats that give you, when you use them, feats that are actions or activities, they give you a bonus when you use them, but they're also, you're using that in lieu of some other action or activity.
Correct. They're mutually exclusive. The action economy precludes you from using them.
Yeah. Yeah, and so that's another thing about the feats. They actually are, I don't think you see this in 5e much, where it's a feat that's just a different thing you can do using your action. They're mutually exclusive. So anyway, I think that
means they're inherently self-regulating in some ways, in that they don't combine to cause bigger and bigger problems in the way that you sometimes could see. Like Pathfinder First Edition had some other things that could be issues where the base game had certain options that were just things that you might want to play on a character, but that were just terribly bad compared to everything else. But it's like, but what if your concept is to play with that weapon that was just made really bad? And so, or that fighting style that just does less damage. And so Pathfinder First Edition reasonably was like, okay, well maybe we'll make an archetype or a feat or something like that that not only gives you what you would expect from a feat, but it gives more because it requires you to use this bad weapon that is worse by X amount. So it gives you, and let's say a feat is worth F, and the amount this weapon is bad is X. So this feat gives you F plus X. It gives you the amount of a feat plus X because you used a really bad weapon. The problem Pathfinder First Edition had was that a lot of people didn't always pay attention to the fact that maybe, you know, Ronald, you wrote one that was like that and you put it in a book for Pathfinder First Edition. But the next person didn't see your feat, and so they made an archetype that gave plus X. And then somebody else made a magic item that gave plus X. And then somebody else made another feat that also gave plus X in a different way. And so then somebody took all 4 of those, and suddenly their character, they were down by X because they used the bad weapon. But then they took 4 things, so they're 3X ahead of where they were supposed to be, because they were all cumulative. And so the weapon that mistakenly did 10 less damage or whatever now is doing 30 extra damage. And that's something Pathfinder 2nd Edition is well insulated against, because of the fact that if you create a weird action that's like, well, it has to be with this weird weapon, and then you create another one, they're going to be competing with each other.
By making them different, mutually exclusive things.
That's right.
All right, so one of the big areas I want to... why was the 3-action system looked into and then eventually used?
I mean, it just, I guess, I don't know why it was looked into. It was one of the things that was on the docket for Unchained, that Stephen Radney McFarlane was, like I said, one of the main people on it. But anytime you said that it was Stephen's system, Jason Bulmahnian would be like, I also helped him on that. So I will say that he also helped on that. He definitely did. And Logan and I also helped refine the one for Unchained. And when it comes to the PF2, everybody worked on it. Don't get me wrong. But the Unchained one, Steven really wrote the first draft on his own, except for however much Jason did in the shadows. And I wasn't there when they first outlined it and decided why to put it in. But as soon as I saw it, they asked me to read it because and my response, which I think was the response of a lot of fans after the book came out, is I was like, this is one of the best action economies I've ever seen for a tabletop RPG that is not good for Pathfinder First Edition. And they were like, yeah, we're thinking of using it in Pathfinder Second Edition. I said, if we can design a game around it, it'll be good. And it's still true, because Pathfinder First Edition had a lot of weird, janky interactions with its own action economy that were required to make certain classes or builds like function in the way they were meant to. And so when you change the action economy, it has unpredictable side effects between those classes and other classes.
I kind of asked the question of why, because it's kind of been a question I've had, because a lot of people, when they play the 3-action system, they're like, why don't other RPGs do this? Like, and it seems kind of intuitive, and it's like, how come someone hasn't thought of this before? And then I go back to
nobody did, and they were in board games, like I mentioned before, but nobody put them into exactly this kind of system into a tabletop RPG. Eventually, somebody has to be the first, right?
Yeah, and the TTRPGs were evolving from war games, and kind of maybe the most intuitive, straightforward thing to do is you can move some because you're not going to stand still, and you get to do one action so that we can make turns as quick as possible. That's my working theory. And then everything else with third edition especially, and Pathfinder 1 were... Oh, and also 4th edition, we're adding different action types so that you can do more than just one action. And it kind of became what you used the metaphor of barnacles once in one of the interviews. It became, it gave people more choices, but it also complicated things. So anyway, that's my working theory.
No, I agree with you. I even met a few people who claimed, because I claimed the 3-action system for Pathfinder 2nd edition is drastically easier to explain than the action system for Pathfinder First Edition. I met some people who didn't agree. I was like, okay. Oh. I was like, so I'm doing my best here to describe them both in the simplest possible way For Pathfinder 2, that is, at the start of your turn, you get 3 actions and 1 reaction, which you can use until your next turn. The 3 actions are on your turn. The reaction can be any time it triggers. And there's also free actions that don't take your action or reaction. That's my best way to thoroughly explain PF2. For PF1, the best way I can thoroughly explain it is you have a standard action and a move action. You can also use the move actions on several other equivalent move actions. You can combine the standard and the move action into a full round action. There's also one full round, which is different than one full round action because it costs a full round action and it continues on until your next turn as well. Although if you only had a standard action left, you can still do a one full round, but it costs your standard action on your next turn. You also have a swift action, which you can use without costing your other actions, except not if you've used an immediate action since your last turn, which you also have and can use off turn. You also
which is different from an attack of opportunity.
You also can take free. Yes, you also have attacks of opportunity, which you can use off turn. Do not take your reactions. Do not take your immediate action. You also have free actions, which don't take any kind of actions. And there's a type of action called not an action, where it doesn't take any kind of action, and sometimes can be done when you're paralyzed and such, and it'll say this is not an action. I believe that's not hyperbole or trying to make it more complicated than it is. I think that is the simplest way to explain all of the types of things you can do on a Pathfinder. Oh wait, I forgot one, which is you can turn your standard action into a move action if you want, but you can't convert any of the other actions into something else.
Yeah, you cannot convert the swift action is exclusive from all that.
Yes.
Yeah. Lovely. So
that is the simplest way, I believe. I'm doing my best to describe the simplest way of giving you all the info in the Pathfinder First Edition action system.
It's almost a chicken and egg problem because you now get the privilege of being the first RPG system built from the ground up that has a 3-action system as a starting point instead of grafting it on, and so brings up a whole lot of other questions which we don't have time for.
I told you that a lot of your questions could have been an entire hour episode.
I mean, the 3-action system, I'll just say it's one thing I pointed out about in one of my videos was that it makes monster design more interesting because you can say some things they do are 1 action, other things they do are 2 actions, and it also creates a decision space where they have all of these options, but they have this a limited currency to spend on. Anyway, it just makes
it's interesting while being easier for the GM to figure out than Pathfinder First Edition, where they might have had like 50 spell-like abilities that you had to kind of go through, and you're like, am I going to use that one? Well, actually, that one that's buried in there is really powerful.
Yeah, and this is the one spell that uses the swift action.
That's right.
Yeah.
Like, you would know that Cold Ice Strike uses swift action if you weren't really on top of things. And you saw it listed among the monster's spell-like abilities, and like there were 30 of them. One of them said Cold Ice Strike, Ultimate Magic, and you'd be like, okay, well, I don't need a cold attack right now, I guess. But then you would have realized, oh, it has 3 times a day Cold Ice Strike. It should be doing this every time on its first 3 rounds because it's swift. And it didn't have anything else that was swift. Absolutely.
Okay, so what is... tell the story of how people came up... Well, I understand you brought it up. It brought up how to adapt a degrees of success system into Pathfinder.
I mean, it's not a giant story. I wrote a document that I put onto the Paizo server that said, let's do 4 degrees of success. And
okay, why did you bring it up?
I described it the way that it currently is with critical success, failure, and critical failure. Done by 10, the nat 20, and the natural 1 did sort of their own different thing. And there was some initial skepticism where everyone was like, they liked some of the things that it did, but they mainly thought it may add too much complication for the advantages because of the fact that you might have to do a -10 plus 10 math on your roll, and that could potentially make it take too long to calculate a d20 roll. However, they were all designers, and designers know, and this is what they told me too, is like, we're doing a playtest. So we're afraid of this, but if you don't playtest the thing that you aren't sure about, and you just go conservative on the playtest, you'll never learn anything. So let's put it in. Let's see. Let's see if that's true or not. Because they definitely agreed with me that there were huge advantages to it, mainly in that spell effects that are save or lose are like, in every edition that doesn't have 4 degrees of success, save or lose spells are terrible, and they are terrible no matter what. They are terrible no matter what because they're terrible when you spend your turn and they save and your turn was wasted. And they're terrible when you spend your turn and they fail and the fight is over because they failed. It's like no matter what happens, nobody had fun except possibly you if you're into One Punch Man. You know, the kind of like, I win immediately and my party doesn't get to do anything. Some people are into that. So possibly one player has fun if they're this certain kind of player, but there's also a chance that nobody has fun and people get mad because you spent your turn doing nothing, or that nobody has fun because you feel bad nobody got to do anything and so does the rest of your team. But with 4 degrees of success, you can put that very unsatisfying results, the 2 very unsatisfying results that are the only results for a save or lose spell, into critical success and critical failure, and then hope that those are both relatively rare, and then put 2 more interesting results that are like, oh, this effect is pretty useful, but not really that useful, and they still happens on a save. And this effect is really good, but it doesn't end the fight or make it a joke on the fail. So that is one of the big things about it. Another big thing about it is that it's like secretly a lot of systems, including Pathfinder First, have a bunch of degrees of success that are kind of hidden, and they're only sometimes, and you have to learn them bespokely. It's like, oh,
like
if you fail
triggering
time
a
check
trap
by 5 or more, you fall. But did you remember which checks are like that? And so by making it always be like that, we go back to, I didn't fully answer your question about what were the design principles of Pathfinder 2nd edition. I told you one of the biggest picture things, but another one was, we wanted a game that was modular, and when you learn how we do things in one place in the game, kind of like in modular computer programming, if you learn how to do it once, you can take that knowledge and you can generalize it. It will work the same way everywhere else. We don't have like a turn undead table that is just works differently than everything else in the game, or like combat maneuver defense in Pathfinder First Edition. But instead, everything is the D20 plus a modifier versus a DC, and things are very consistent. So by using 4 degrees of success everywhere, since we always knew that we use multiple degrees of success in some places, that allowed us to create that kind of modular universal rule that you learn once and apply anywhere. And it doesn't require us to put in 4 different things, right? Attack rolls, they don't have a special effect on a critical failure. They just do the same thing. We still check if you critically failed in case your opponent is a swashbuckler who's going to riposte you on a critical failure, but it doesn't do anything worse by default.
I have another question, but first I just want to comment that I can see why you would definitely desperately feel like you need a playtest, because if it turned out that +10, -10 wasn't a hit, you would have to revisit the encounter level balancing system, because so much of what makes bosses scary now is they can critically hit you so often and cause you to critically fail on their save or suck effects.
That is part of the math that made it work. Let me tell you, it is incredibly difficult to get a working monster encounter builder when you also are doing kind of the idea that a monster is a monster is a monster, and the monster you fought now that was a scary ogre at first level who was the boss will be the same monster that's a mook when you're higher level. That is very hard. We talked about the fact that 4E, to some extent at least, and I'm not enough of an expert to say how far, but to some extent I at least can tell they did succeed at making a balanced encounter builder, but partially they did that by at level 10 you fight level 10 minions, level 10 regulars, level 10 elites, and level 10 bosses. And you don't have to be able to fight the level 7 monsters then, and the level 13 monsters as the bosses. That's actually much more difficult to get it to work. And yes, 4 degrees of success help with that a significant amount. It helps with a lot of weird side effects that you wouldn't expect, such as it makes it so that roll twice effects are actually more more consistent depending on the chance that you have of succeeding than they are if you don't have 4 degrees of success, assuming that it's a like double on a crit, single, then half damage, then no damage, or something like a basic save. You wind up seeing that a roll twice and take the worst or better is closer to being the same, as good as the same amount of bonus across all of the range of dice rolls, whereas on 2 types of success it drastically distorts at the ends.
There are commenters wanting to extend gratitude and thanks to you and the designers for 4 degrees of success.
Well, it was obviously
critical
a team
success.
effort. I was the one who was pushing it, but they were the ones who were the experienced designers who had the experience to know that even though they had hesitation, that the smart move was to playtest it because of the fact that that's how you find out, right? Like a less inclusive team of new members might have just been like, you know what, no, though, we're worried about it, we won't do it. But Pathfinder design team was always very supportive of my designs and each other's designs, and whenever there's a chance at a playtest where it's like, I'm hesitant about this, but you know what, we'll playtest it. We'll see if it works or not.
Yeah. What was my next question? You were talking about some things that were Pathfinder, one of the overall design goals, which if there was more you wanted to say on that, definitely do. But you said that one was to make it so that if you understood how a rule worked here, you'll understand how it works elsewhere.
Yes.
And my question is about what are some other examples of that?
Other than checks and DCs?
Yeah.
4 degrees of success is one of them. Proficiency, right? In Pathfinder First Edition, your saving throws either went up at 1/3 of your level or half your level plus 2, depending on which they were. Whereas your base attack bonus was either half your level or 3/4 of your level or all of your level. With some classes that got even more that was not technically in the base progression, while skills were equal to either were a kind of a disparate amount where you put in however many you wanted to, and you might also get an additional 3 or not. So, but you just put in a certain number of points into the skills. And fundamentally, attack rolls, skill checks, and saving throws are very similar types of things, but they're progressions. And here I'm not talking about how to roll them. I'm talking about how the math is calculated in this case. The proficiency progressions, they weren't called proficiency in Pathfinder First Edition, were very different. And spell DCs, which went up by, well, roughly half your level if it's your highest level spell, but not necessarily because you're using a variety of spells, and everything just had a different math for how quickly it went up.
So it's not only... I was first thinking you might bring up something like counteracting. You learned that rule in one place.
That's a good one. Counteracting is actually one of the most complicated rules in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Once you learn it, you can use it in a lot of places, and it is... I feel that despite the fact that it is a very challenging rule, that it is an absolute workhorse in making sure that weird low-level spells don't just kind of jankily defeat powerful abilities in the same way as... Like in First Edition, there was like a salt shaker that was released that accidentally could like defeat Baba Yaga's curses or like a curse placed by a deity, and it was just like it didn't say that it mattered what level or DC the curse was. It just said it removed it, and it was like this. It became like after that was released in like in a random book. Like I was just like a player, but one of our friends was a freelancer, and it became like a Baba Yaga salt shaker became a thing that we talked about to the point that he bought Linda and me a salt shaker of Baba Yaga with Baba Yaga on it. So Counteract avoids that situation and causes it so that if you put a lot of effort into your spell, they have to put a lot of effort into it to defeat it, and it avoids sort of the 5e counterspell problem.
I love
where they eventually just made it so that counterspell doesn't even work on monsters anymore. Is that a new thing they did, I think, in 5e?
That some monsters will have abilities that are spell adjacent, but not spells.
Yes.
I'm just realizing I want to put it on my list. I think maybe I should have a video explaining counteracting because I think it's great. It means that you cannot you cannot disbelieve a archmage's illusion. Things like that. It allows us for so much. Oh, but I was going to say that when on the consistency question, that your answer was actually getting at more of kind of a broader sense of what consistency means, in that you get the results you expect. So you you know. And I was thinking about what you had said earlier. You can be a diplomacy-focused character, but not actually be diplomacy effective in another system. But you know you are in Pathfinder 2, and you can express your skill in level plus proficiency. I'm a master at medicine and level 9, and you know exactly what that means. There's fewer surprises that are sprung upon players and also GMs who are building encounters. That's just a kind of overall benefit, it seems, of consistency to me.
And there's fewer times that you just don't know what you're gonna do or how things work. Like, here's an example from Pathfinder First Edition. So I want to feint you in Pathfinder First Edition, Ronald. What am I rolling against?
Oh god, I know this. 10 plus half hit die plus wisdom modifier.
That is one of the options that I could be rolling against. I believe there's two possibilities. It is the higher of 10 plus your sense motive modifier and the thing that you said. I think. Let me check. Let's score this. Oh no, you were thinking of intimidation. That's what I was gonna go to next.
Oh no!
It's either 10 plus sense motive, like I said, or 10 plus base attack bonus plus wisdom modifier. Intimidate is 10 plus half level plus wisdom modifier.
Rules lawyer gets a rule wrong.
It adds any bonuses that are only applied against fear. To saving throws against fear are also added to that 10 plus the target's hit dice plus their wisdom modifier. So it's base attack bonus based. Whereas in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, it's never this weird bespoke formula that who knows what it's going to be. You always know it's going to be some kind of DC. So even if you couldn't remember that perception is used for things like sensing someone's motive and against deception almost every time, which it is, you still, like, the worst you would do with feint is be like, oh, maybe it's will DC, I guess. Or fortitude or reflex DC. I mean, those don't sound right, but at least you're putting it, you have the tools to do it, whereas your rules lore knowledge let you get something that at least was close. But somebody in Pathfinder 1st Edition doesn't really have any tools to say what feint is against unless they've memorized it, right?
Yeah.
How are you supposed to know it's 10 plus base attack bonus plus wisdom modifier? Nothing is that except for feint.
I do like how 2E uses the saving throw DCs, which I think 4E did also.
Sort of.
Oh no, people are yelling, cancel Ronald. Ronald is bad. Got the rules wrong.
4E religiously had players roll all the things, pretty much, except for like the enemy's attack rolls. So therefore, you would roll against. The only thing that you would do is roll your spells against their reflex. Like, there wasn't a such thing as a reflex that was rolled by the monster.
Including
you
fireball.
roll against reflex defense. If you're the one who did it, then you roll against their defense. So they were only passive. Whereas in PF2, it can be passive or active depending on the situation.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a hybrid of that of those two things, but really it didn't come from either of them. It was just the idea of you can use this mechanic in two different ways, which is sort of more like the way that, I guess, do 4E and 5E have like passive things like passive perception and passive things like that. So it's kind of more like that than it is like the way that 4E did reflex defense, I think.
So, one of the things I wanted to get into was, why does... Okay, I'll say my specific question. My question is, why does adding to... Looking at, in the encounter building math, it's clear that there is a consistent logarithmic progression. And...
That's right.
When you add 2 levels to a creature, it counts as twice the amount of challenge in the encounter building system. Now, that suggests there's some math going on that I don't understand.
There's a lot of math that had to go on to make
I was hoping you could get into that because I wanted to get at wanted to understand more why the encounter building system of 2e works as well as it does. And don't be afraid to get too technical. I so I was hoping you could get into that.
Do you want to know why it was +2, or do you want to know why we successfully made it be +2? Or sorry, do you want to know why it was +2 in particular?
No.
It +2 equals twice, or do you want to know how we successfully did it?
How you successfully did it.
Okay.
Because Pathfinder 1e purported to do this too, to have...
Yes, and that is the answer to why. Okay. Which is Pathfinder 1e claimed that it was doing that, but didn't, and we wanted the stories to be the same stories. We wanted to tell we asked the developers who were telling the stories, right, using the rules that the design team came up with, what they wanted. And one of the number one things they said is, like, you can change a lot of the rules, make it run in a way that works better but we want to be able to tell our stories. Some cases, the rules might not have even allowed that in Pathfinder First Edition. There are ways to change it to make it work better, to tell the stories. That would be ways that the developers were like, oh yeah, we're constantly adding in that, like, in an AP, oh yeah, this person cast the charm spell over and over again until they were eventually fully charmed. Can you make an inveigle ritual that just makes them charmed, period? And we're like, yeah, sure, we can do that. But one of the things they wanted is the stories to stay the same. And so to answer the one that you specifically said you weren't asking me, but then that you kind of answered, yes. Second edition does the +2, successfully does the +2 equals twice as many, because First Edition claimed to do that and did not succeed. First Edition's builder, you kind of had to ignore what it told you and just playtest the encounters. I had a ton of fun at First Edition, and I just playtested against myself playing my own players' characters to figure out how hard it would actually be. Because it was not, the encounter builder didn't really tell me that. So for Second Edition, we knew that was the target, because we needed to let the stories be the same stories we told from Pathfinder First Edition. So how do you hit that target? Well, obviously we're not going to double your hit points and damage or something like that every time you level up twice, so that a level 20 character does like 2 to the 10th power amount of damage and hit points of a first level character. That would be a little
doubling
intense.
Offense and doubling defense. Yeah. That's what that would be.
Having 1,000 times more at actual hit points and damage at level 20 to compared to level 1 might be a little bit problematic. So, yeah, you're kind of getting at it there, which is, if you can get to an overall double value by not quite doubling offense and doubling defense, but if you have a character that kind of is twice as valuable as another character, partially because of having a certain amount more survivability and partially because of having a certain amount more offense. So, for example, if you have one character that survives for 4 rounds, during which it causes a certain amount of havoc each round, and another one survives for 2 rounds, causing the same amount of havoc, it obviously has been able to do twice as much stuff to the enemy team, right? So in some cases, if you can be sure that their survivability has doubled the amount of time they will stay on the field and actually be active and not disabled by disabling effects and doing their stuff, you're kind of doing twice as much danger to the PCs. Now, they have twice as much time to heal it back, so it's not quite that dangerous. Similarly, if you have an opponent who dies equally easily but does double damage, then you are actually causing spike damage, which can be much more problematic for people, even than something that lasts longer. But you may have doubled or even more than doubled for a team that's based on healing and like spreading things out, the threat, just by doubling the offense. So if you can get some multiplier of both the offense and the defense, maybe the square root of 2, somewhere around there, and you multiply that together, say something lasts 1.5 times as long, for 1.5 times the damage, then you can get there. But obviously, damage isn't going up even that much when you level up from 10 to 12.
Yeah, I was going to say, the creature building chart, for hit points at least, is somewhat linear, and
It is.
And the elite simple adjustment for a monster says just add 20 hit points at level 6 and higher. It says that.
So,
it's a linear progression. And
it is a linear progression.
It's not logarithmic at all. And so I was a little... And okay, let's say hit points.
Yeah, you figured it out. You jumped to the next thing I was going to say, which is we still don't do a logarithmic plus 50% every 2 levels. Instead, the logarithm is sort of essentially approximated by a large number of polynomials.
Okay.
And like you said, pretty linear, roughly linear. But if you have enough things that are linear, then it can give you something
because they multiply with each other.
It's about what you want.
Yes.
Also, the secret is that some of it is, it's got a polynomial component and a logarithmic component, and the logarithmic component is hidden because the logarithmic component is the attack roll versus AC, saving throw versus DC, all of that math is actually a multiplier. It looks linear, but it's really a multiplier.
Right.
And here's why. If I give you a +3 and you needed a 10 to hit me, and I gave you a +3, you do 50% more damage. That's a multiplier.
Yep.
And that's true at any level. If you needed
level.
a 10 to hit me and I give you a +3 on your attack roll, you will do 50% more damage.
That's part of the Titan math. The +1 is underestimated, and it has an equal effect at every level because the math is going up as you level up.
Bingo. So if it it's different at different, in there are edge cases where it's worth more than this. There are also some bad spots on the die where it's worth less than this. But if I need exactly a 10 to hit you, a +1 is worth +1/6 to my damage. A +3 is worth +50%. So what does that mean? Well, that means that if I level up twice and that gave me +3 accuracy, which it often does, depending on your levels, I've just gotten +50% damage from the accuracy boost alone.
Okay.
So that's where it is. So it's using a bunch of... It's got a polynomial component, which is in the hit points and damage. It's got a component that's secretly logarithmic, which is the amount of benefit you get from your attack rolls versus AC. And when you mix that all together, as it turns out, it approximates it well enough. There are certain ways that things change, which players have noted and was very expected, which is, like, for example, people mentioned the solo boss is roughly is a little bit stronger compared to other things that are worth the same XP at low levels, and is weaker compared to things that are worth the same XP at high levels. And that's because of the way that these components factor in. It's impossible to get a perfect doubling every 2 levels. This system is pretty darn close, but was very carefully designed to do that. But it's not, nothing is perfect, and they're gonna be a little weaker than they were back at the beginning of the game, the solo monster. But you can still, just like you did in your fire dragon fight that I saw at level 20 on your stream, you can still have a very satisfying big boss fight, even at 20th level.
To what extent was this all mathed out and successful before the playtest, and did you need the playtest in order to come up with to refine this math?
I mean, to some extent that the playtest already had done this, but the playtest also the playtest had already done it more or less, but the playtest helped us laser focus in on certain areas where it was like, okay, this may be working, but we can do the same thing, but make it feel like, but increase the feel by changing this one up and this one down, or change this thing this way and that thing that way. The playtest helped because it had a stress test, the Heroes of Under an Adventure, where you're expected to die. Almost nobody does those, and that they are incredibly helpful because they tell you exactly how strong things really are. Because in order to actually determine if your encounter building system, where it breaks, you want to, just like with a lot of stress testing in real life with a physical object, you want to run it until you break the thing. And to find out if something is actually balanced or working, you kind of want to run until the group dies. Nobody does that normally. It's an issue, and it's one that caused people to, like, for example, in Pathfinder 1st Edition, there's a feat called Crane Wing that let you automatically block an attack every turn. and it was absolutely busted in any situation where your team was actually going to lose. Like, the amount that it prevented your team from losing a fight that they were going to lose was incredibly high if that fight was based on attack rolls. But a lot of people correctly said, oh, this feat isn't causing any problems in our group. It barely does anything at all. And that's because they were never fighting anything that was very challenging anyway. They were just winning, and it was defensive. So it wasn't a balance concern for them. So in PF2, one of the big things the playtest did was by having that death test where we run you until you die. And some groups did beat the ridiculously Bulmahnian gauntlet that Jason Bulman threw at them, where he threw every demon that he could think of.
Bulmahnian, is that a word in Paizo?
Yes, Bulmahnian. It is an adjective.
That sounds like a great word.
I invented Bulmahnian as an adjective for an adventure that is incredibly hard, that is written by Jason Bulman.
Okay, I gotta call my Fall of Plaguestone playthrough Bulmahnian.
Fall of Plaguestone, Rebel's Ransom in Pathfinder 1st Edition, Bonekeep in Pathfinder 1st Edition, any of those. So he threw his worst at people, and some people actually beat it. But most groups didn't, and finding out how and where they died helped us narrow down and realize we were actually already doing a pretty solid job on it. So the playtest was helpful, but even before it, because we also had some in-house playtests and a lot of refinement, we were already at a point where it certainly was a more accurate character builder than first edition by a mile, I guess. And if it was a 1 mile marathon, then it was still by almost a mile, where first edition's builder was like just near the starting line, and it was close to the finish line.
I mean, it seems like the first, since, I mean, okay, 4E started it, but it's actually engineered to be balanced.
I think most people's encounter builders are engineered to try to be balanced. The problem is that it doesn't always work.
You gotta limit the bonuses in 1E, and
anyway, that's part of the issue.
Yeah,
is that in some ways you could even say that the encounter builders that didn't work, that it's not even their. It's not the encounter builder's fault so much as other things in the system, and that maybe the encounter builder would have been fine if the system wasn't so ridiculously rock paper scissors-ish that you could build a character that. And here's one for 3.5, which is similar to Pathfinder but not the same. I ran an epic level game. Most people say that you can't. I could because I play tested, and so my level 21 PCs easily beat a CR 40 monster that they fought. It was easy. Then they almost TPK'd to a CR 21. And I knew in advance that would happen because I playtested, and it was very rock, paper, scissors. They had the right thing. Like, the 40 had a low touch AC, and the 21 had a really dangerous saving throw effect that the party had weak saves on. I playtested, so I knew. So I made the 41, like, look scary, but not really be an important encounter. And I made the 21 be, like, an arc boss. But if I hadn't done that, and I had done it based on levels, they would have been pretty unsatisfied. And that one is not really 3.5's fault. It's not the encounter builder's fault. Like you said, it's the fault of the fact that the characters are just so wildly more powerful at some things than others that you don't know what the encounter is going to do until you hit the encounter.
Mark, have you seen my video about we did a Marshals v. Casters event on my Discord server. It resulted in a long live play, and then I did a video wrapping up that event.
I did not see it, but I read the thread on the PF2 subreddit somewhat.
Okay. All right, because in talking about...
It was a live play, so I didn't watch it. Live plays.
Sure.
And Roll for Combat is a live play. It's a lovely live play. I work for Roll for Combat. You should watch it, but I don't watch live plays.
Yeah. You're bringing up the playtest, so it got me thinking about how did one of the more heated topics and within Pathfinder, among Pathfinder 2nd Edition players, is martial caster balance. And
I would say that it's not one of the more heated topics among Pathfinder 2nd Edition players. I would say it's one of the more heated topics among all D20 system players who play any game that has a martial and a caster.
Great transition to my question. What was the thinking behind that? And did you see it as a problem to address? And what did you do to it for it? And did the playtest? I mean, like, there's some talk about how the fighter has this +2 and is to attack, and so it's therefore inherently better than the other marshals. But I have to think that you need those other marshals have abilities, class features that the fighter doesn't have, and that they must have some role to play in actually making them balanced. I bring that up as an example because casters and marshals are on complete. They're playing different. They're doing very different things by default in Pathfinder 2e. And one of the criticisms of 4e, which I talked about in the video, was that they made some players bounced off of it because they thought they made them too similar. But 2e was able to preserve casters casting spells that having their own spell lists,
Sure.
while marshals don't. And I just want to know how did the team accomplish this, and what were you?
Okay.
Yeah.
So 4E, and I heard from someone who was there, like one of the initial ideas, right, was that, you know how in video games, to make it easier to learn the buttons for an action game, there's a lot of games where it's like, what is it? X will be a light attack and Y will be a strong attack and A will be a dodge roll or something like that. There are like some certain key buttons that are similar for a lot of things. So like, what if classes could be like that? Was at least something that had been going around their office during 4E. An interesting idea that worked in another type of game, and some people didn't like it in a tabletop RPG. In terms of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, we were very careful because we wanted to think about the story of each of the classes. And thinking about the story of the classes did not always mean thinking about exactly how this one mechanical interaction in the class that was the most overpowered in the class happened to work that a lot of people took. It was more thinking about what is the story, what is the experiential story of this class, what is it telling, what kind of characters are we making, sort of narratively rather than mechanically. And to do that meant that characters had to be able to have a wide range of expressions and not kind of like we'll have the 3 buttons, the daily button and the at-will button and the per encounter button, but more like a spectrum of possibilities for how they're expressed. And so I think that's how we did it, is just by taking an approach where we deeply looked into the narrative of the class and putting that first rather than having like necessarily a framework that we were stuck to.
Was there looking at data coming back from the playtest to see how some classes performed compared to others?
There definitely was. There definitely was looking at it, and even going into it, because the question that I think you almost asked because you made a lot of build up to it, but that from what I heard you then asked a slightly different one, was like working towards trying to make marshals less overshadowed and less replaceable than they were in Pathfinder 1st Edition. And that's something that to a pretty large extent we had already succeeded at in the playtest, but we looked at the feedback to see if we had or not. It was something we were very, very cognizant of, because the caster marshal disparity that some tables had in Pathfinder 1st Edition is a pretty serious problem for those tables. Other tables didn't have it at all, mainly because of the fact that any character, including a marshal in Pathfinder 1st Edition, could be built so busted that they would just one round any encounter that would be fairly built using the Pathfinder 1st Edition encounter building system without like kind of loading it up with things where it was like, oh, this monster is pre-buffed these 4 buffs and has 16 higher AC than it would be expected to have. And so like there were groups that were like, no, marshals are fine. You know, my gunslinger just kills everything as soon as he gets on initiative. But other groups would be like, well, they're not fine because you won't get on initiative because the enemies will do a saving throw effect that takes you out of the fight and no one can remove it except the spellcasters. Then there were other groups that were thinking about narrative effects. And so like my group, for example, which had more marshals, they was not one of the groups that removed them in Pathfinder 1st Edition. The idea that the caster teleports everyone was kind of seen as more of like a communal good. If by which I mean everyone would get together and be like, we need to get here. Who can teleport us? Oh, it's either Violetta or Vi, because we had a Violetta and a Vi, which was short for Violetta, because we had two people made a character named Violetta in the same group and did not realize it until we came in and we're like, no, that's funny because some people in the real world have the same name. I'll just go by Vi. It's like Violetta and Vi could both teleport us. Which one should we do? Well, we need a counter greater dispel magic from Violetta, so we'll have Vi do the teleport. And like our group would think together with it, and that maybe the monk would say that, and then I play Vi, so I'd be like, okay, yeah, I'll cast the teleport. At that point, everyone kind of felt like they were engaged. Whereas at some tables, the fact that Vi cast the teleport and not the monk was a serious problem that caused the monk to be very jealous and feel like they weren't doing anything or contributing. And at other tables, some people would think that kind of makes them the mules for the party, that they're doing all of these things, and they would rather be busting out fireballs in those effects. So it was a very nuanced and problem in Pathfinder First Edition that didn't always show up at every table, and when it did, it looked different at every table. So we tried to address that by first and foremost making sure that certain abilities that in First Edition just made your non-spellcaster character obsolete, instead were built to work together with non-spellcasting characters, possibly making them better. So for example, in Pathfinder First Edition, there's a knock spell that was just like, oh, this just opens. It's gonna open your door. It had in 3.5 it just automatically did. I think in Pathfinder First it had a very high bonus that was definitely better than most people would have had unless they really spent a lot of resources on their disabled device. And in Pathfinder's Second Edition, it's like, okay, here's what it does. You can use your spell modifier on this, or you can give a huge bonus to your rogue when they open it, because you kind of got it loose for them. And so that is a way to, if you were playing my group, and everyone talked and was like, okay, have the wizard use knock, maybe everyone would be satisfied. But in a lot of groups, the rogue or fighter might be dissatisfied by that, but they'd be more satisfied by the wizard casting knock to give them a +4, and then they make the check. So we looked at things like that, or where there were a lot of things in First Edition where the magic spell would just say, ha ha ha, this is a first level spell. All mundane means of tracking you automatically fail. Even if they have +70, it doesn't matter. But if they cast this other first level spell, they can track you, because magic beats everything. We would then generally change it to be like, oh, well, it's harder to track you unless you cast this other spell. You get to use your spell DC, even if you didn't cover your tracks or anything, and that's probably much harder than the normal tracking. But if someone's really good at tracking, they can track it. So in all cases where spells just became this absolute barrier that no martial character could enter, maybe someone thought about it and was like, oh, I'll make a feat that in First Edition that lets you track people who have been using magic that makes it so you can't be tracked. It's like, well, that's great, but now you had to spend an additional feat just to get through that one thing. So in Second Edition, you could just almost always, you can natively get past a hoop that magic puts up in front of you. Magic just makes it harder, but your mundane skill is always going to eventually be good enough that you can handle it.
So my initial question was probably, okay, there are a few things. There's different dimensions, it seems, to the martial caster balance debate, and one of them is how much damage you can do, which seems to me like a more straightforward problem than what you're talking about.
Oh, it's definitely not straightforward.
Well, I'm not saying it's...
it's actually very challenging, because
I'm sure it's challenging.
The question is that they're supposed to do the same amount of damage, you've already lost all of the other dimensions of the debate. Because the spellcasters obviously have better utility, better support, and better other abilities. So if you... Once you've accepted the premise that spellcasters are supposed to do the same amount of damage as martial characters do, some of those tables I was talking about in Pathfinder First Edition that had issues are going to have issues with anything else you've done.
What I mean is that the overall question of balance, if you don't look at simply damage, but the overall kind of... Okay, if martials and casters were contributing equal damage, the fact that the casters have this whole realm of things they can do in outside of combat, utility, makes them stronger. And so that's not satisfying. There's a more complex, thorny problem.
Yeah.
And you were speaking to
separate
group dynamics.
Into a black box and just do one at a time.
So,
because it's all interconnected.
So we won't have time to go into the kind of the details, but it seems like one of the things you were talking about was how skills are kind of more, well, one could say, more powerful. Skills have more uses, more defined uses, are more
Or
reliant
at least
upon...
they are less likely to be trivialized.
Right,
We
because...
made an effort when something is happening to not say, "Oh, and if you have this skill, you're gone."
Right.
Like anytime there's a spell that'll be like, we try to be very careful because sometimes you'll mess over a skill and you won't think about it. A lot of times a freelancer will put in a spell and I'm like, oh, this automatically defeats the deception skill to disguise. They didn't mean to. They were just trying to make a spell that like did this other thing about undead, like in case there were undead around. But it means that a vampire can't be disguised as a noble, and so we would add in a line being like, if the undead is in disguise, they can roll a deception check against your spell DC to avoid it, or something like that. So it's being cognizant of allowing skills to be a toggle that makes it so that a spell never absolutely does a thing to a character with skills, but the skill has a chance to win if the person is very skillful at it.
And I think that it seems not only in the realm of skill checks, but overall, what you have less of in 2E is someone soloing something. I can completely resolve the situation with my one ability. I can make the villain into stone, or I can... what you usually have are... the way it's overall balanced is that you need and this was kind of the conclusion of the Marshals v. Casters video, was you need people working together in order to make each individual shine.
Well, we tried to make it so people work together was the most fun and most effective, because it's kind of degenerate when you figure out that you have a meta where it's just like, oh yeah, don't even roll anything except for save or lose spellcasters in Pathfinder First Edition, and then you just make everything lose. And you have somebody who has a pet who can deal damage, so that eventually when the things that lost, they only lost for 10 rounds. You need to be able to eventually kill them during those 10 rounds. But that kind of became the meta, right? And we were trying to avoid that from being more powerful, and make it so that the meta was more cooperation, having a variety of skill sets, and having characters fulfill a lot of different things on their team. And it doesn't have to be exactly fighter, rogue, cleric, wizard. That's not even necessarily the best one, but that just some diversity makes you stronger than just repeating something that seemed to be the most powerful. And sure, spellcasters, their flexibility is going to help them. And I know in your Marshal vs. Casters videos, the casters won because they're ultimately more flexible and doing more average damage in a White Room situation where everything's fine. It's not necessarily going to make you win in the real game where the casters can make sure that everything is not fine for you.
Yeah, and it seems like it was almost an unintended, but maybe it was intended, effect of balancing the game where, and I want to know, it means that how you adapt. Okay, I like Slay the Spire, which I just started playing 4 days ago, because you can't walk into that game and decide, I'm going to make this kind of deck. You have to see what cards are available in the offer, and then build your deck based on what your first couple of choices are, and you're constantly, and even then you want to be able to pivot at some point. And I find one of the things that initially made me start my channel was I did some combat demonstrations where I really went to highlight how the system actually, the best way to play it usually is to always be looking at what's happening on this turn. You know, where are your party members at? Is it better to flank now? You don't want to do the same thing every turn. I just want to know if that was a
100%
explicitly talked about in the design team as a goal.
It's not just an emergent effect that happened by accident. That was very intentional, and we worked very hard to try to make that happen because we thought that was cool and it was more fun than like that because there are a lot of things you need to do for that. One of which is you need to make sure the math is more balanced, because the moment that you have math that lets you have an I win button that's 30 higher than you're expected to for your level or whatever it is, then of course that I win button is the thing that you do every turn because it wins. Why wouldn't you do that every turn? I would do that every turn. Until I got bored that I was winning that much, but until then I would. And so it's one of the requirements to get you that diversity of actions, that thinking on your feet, that makes horizontal build styles useful. Is that you need to get rid of the ability to have one thing that is just so powerful that it's better than all of your other options by too much. Because if you tried to offer horizontal options in Pathfinder First Edition, they wouldn't be any good. Because the best version of your move was just so much better, right? It was like how, unless you did some really weird things, options like Spring Attack or Vital Strike in Pathfinder First Edition had a lot of trouble being competitive because Full Attack, your best option, was so absurdly ridiculous after a certain point that no matter, you would need to really make any other option also very ridiculous, more than people would probably put in a feat to make it compete.
We're going to end in about 10 minutes, and so
All right.
that wraps up the kind of overall PF2 design questions I had, and I feel like I could ask more follow-up questions.
I warned you. I
would love to be able to to be able to talk to you again. Maybe I can go on your show again and ask questions from the guest spot. But I did have a few burning questions that I wanted to ask. One from the audience, and just see. And I completely understand you don't work for Paizo anymore, and I'm not asking you to say what Paizo will do. These are generally, you may be able to answer them. It's basically what I'm saying. Also, I want to give you some time to say what you're involved with at the end. Okay, first is in the aid action is something that the core rulebook says the GM has ultimate say in what the DC is, but
yes.
It should be kind of what's presumed is that use 20 as a default.
Is 20.
Just want to know what the thinking was behind that, because there's been, I came out against that rule in one of my videos. Well, it's not a rule, let's say.
I proposed that maybe it was using a standard DC for your level or something like that. And generally, the team's analysis is that was too complicated and also didn't have very good grounding in the narrative for why it was harder to aid someone who was higher level, and so they preferred the 20. But
okay.
I certainly, you need to be very careful about all of the options that apply to aid. If you change it to be more like the way, I think that doing a standard one based on your level is great. However, if you do, certain options that were written that are like, by this level, whatever, it's already DC 20, we can let you get a success no matter what, you probably will. Some of those options are going to become overpowered if you make the DC scale, or underpowered.
Was the DC by being determined by the level of the main task considered, and what about the effect it might have on level 1 players not having much of a chance to get at 20, and level 20 players getting a plus 4? That was one of the reasons that I gave for
using the DC by level. The problem is that there's not always a level of the task that's super obvious, depending on what you're doing or how it's being done. For example, you could say like the highest appropriate level that you can find for the task, but in that case, it could be a little weird. So like, let's say you are trying to help your bard who is doing a group impression on like the king who's level 15 and the queen who's level 17, and you're low level, and then like 3 peasants who are level, or not, 3 low level courtiers who are level 4, and it's like, well, what level is that? So there was also just use the level of the bard you're assisting, because you have to be a certain amount effective to help someone of that level. But ultimately, none of the rationales really sort of sat right with the team as a whole, and it was felt to be more complicated. So
do you know
20 was sort of the thing that went in at the end.
Do you know whether, okay, this is now another question I'm going to ask. Do you know whether is there a common understanding, maybe it's not written in the book, about whether a spontaneous caster can use a 3rd level spell slot to cast something they know at 1st level?
It's not written in the book. and I don't answer rules adjudication questions, I'm more likely to do it now than at Paizo. I know you said, oh, you're not at Paizo now, so you won't do it. I'm more likely to because people are less able to use my rulings as a bludgeon, but they still kind of are. In fact, actually, I've seen people try to do it, and it gets nastier, because then it gets into, well, Mark Seifter doesn't work for Paizo anymore, so everything he says is wrong, and then it gets into a fight about that. I've seen it occur.
Okay. All right,
and
so
you may
you
think that
defer
I'm
to the
making that
book.
up, but I can link you to something like that if I found it. I would say, think about what makes sense for your group and is more fun for you.
All right, sounds good.
Like if it's more fun for you to be able to cast a spell of Fleet Step using a 3rd level slot once you run out of your 1st and your 2nd level slots, and you really want Fleet Step, but it's not a signature spell, then maybe allow it. Think about if it's going to do anything problematic.
I'll answer the question then.
Or not.
I think I'll answer the question so I can be the target of hate and be used as a bludgeon. I think you should use be able to use higher level spell slots because you're a spontaneous caster. Hello. Okay. Next question is
like it's just based on whether your group thinks you should. It doesn't technically say directly that you can't. It also doesn't say that you can't.
Okay. Next question, my last question. Well, it's kind of related. 2 related questions.
Okay.
Say what you can on them. Is why are there no magical shields that also have increased hit points and hardness? Why are they separated off from sturdy shields?
Wait, you said why are there no magical shields that also have increased hit points and hardness?
Wait, I don't know if that's
I don't
true.
think that's true.
No.
I
but
think that there are a lot of magical shields that have increased hit points and hardness.
If you want a shield, okay, I haven't read all the shields. That could be a wrong statement.
Okay.
But if you want the shield that has the highest hardness and hit points, you go with the sturdy shield. And that you do not go with a magical shield. And I just want to know if what the thinking was behind that.
It is a magical shield, right?
I don't think so. It just says a specialty shield on the Archives of Nethys. But okay, you know what I mean though. Maybe that's not the right term.
So what you're saying is, why do sturdy shields have more hardness and hit points than the highest other hardness and hit point that you can find on an equally leveled magic shield that also has other special abilities? Yeah. So I guess my question, to your question, why does the fighter have 2 more accuracy, but my barbarian, who also has rage, why can't I have the 2 more accuracy as well?
Okay.
Like why should a shield that's the same level as the sturdy shield have equal hardness and hit points and a special ability? That would just be better. Okay.
I think that adequately answers that. Though
now I'm going to answer the question that I think may be hiding in the margins, which is why. Which is, wait a minute, there aren't a lot of shields that have higher hardness and hit points in the core rulebook. That's true. There aren't a lot of shields at all in the core rulebook. I think Spiky Shield and Lion Shield may be the only ones with an increased hardness and hit points. It has an overusage of shields like the Spellguard Shield with an absurdly powerful non-block special ability. It's the one where you get +2 to all saving throws. It's like level 4. Oh, okay. It's good at level 20.
I think I should look at some of the shields more closely.
Shields
but I think part of
better hardness and hit points.
But I think part of that argument is maybe they haven't really looked into how awesome some of those magical abilities are. And my co-admin of my server wants to know, is there a tower shield? What is it, Sean, that has higher hit points and hardness? Well, you probably know. I mean, okay. He can't answer about the future of what Paizo published.
Like look up
Grand Bazaar. He knows
some
about
of the later
that.
Shields.
Okay.
Look up some of the later shields that have been published, and you'll find some that are like that. But Tower Shield also has the ability to give you the ability to take cover and let all your allies potentially you create this cover. Can give +4 AC in the right circumstances. So it sort of is the ultimate AC giving shield. So it doesn't have something that makes it as sturdy as a sturdy shield. Then it would be the ultimate AC and the ultimate blocking shield in one. And if it was also as sturdy as the sturdy shield, there wouldn't be that much reason. I guess it does. It's pretty heavy, but other than that, there wouldn't be much reason to use the.
So it is some thought was put into it. It sounds like, and it was a
Now that being said, the core rulebook definitely did not have enough shields that had increased hit points and hardness, and it had way too many of its percentage that were just all based on having a very powerful special ability for its level. Let's do spell turning at the level where the first level where it could be is on the shield. Okay, well, how much is left to make the shield have more hardness and hit points? Not much. And so some of the later shields did a lot better in giving them more moderate special abilities, so there was room to give them more a good amount more hardness and hit points. If you want a system that lets you split that apart and do what you want to do, where you get the hardness and hit points by default and then put a mild special ability on it, one of which is sturdy, which makes it go all the way up to sturdy, check out the monster parts system from Battle Zoo Bestiary. In Roll for Combat's Battle Zoo.
Go ahead and talk about what you're working on.
I wrote the monster parts system, and when you do shields, that's how they work. They all have a level scaling that scales up their hit points and hardness, as if you wanted to go halfway to sturdy always. It doesn't let you build something like the Spellguard shield that's only about some ridiculous saving throw ability. It's going to be always giving you some of the sturdiness, and then on top of that, you either throw sturdy, which puts you exactly to sturdy, or you throw something else like energy resistance or some other special ability, and then that won't get you all the way to sturdy, but it will put you closer to there and give you some other special ability.
That's an excellent plug. And what else is Roll for Combat putting out?
Well, Roll for Combat you can get Battle Zoo Bestiary right now on battlezoo.com. In addition to Battle Zoo Ancestry's Dragons, my 130-some page
to
book
complement your dungeon ancestry.
Yes, which you can get on battlezoo.com for free. It says 1 cent, but it doesn't really charge you the 1 cent. The 1 cent is a trick because you can't list something for 0 cents on Backer Kit, but you can just not charge the 1 cent. But the Dragon Ancestry, which is a 132-page book, which I think one of the selling points of that book is, it may even be a few pages more than that. One of the selling points is that the only thing in this book is an ancestry with 3 archetypes for that ancestry, information about that ancestry, and a 2-page horde subsystem where you get hordes instead of like collecting magic items, and you get boosted based on how cool your horde is. So the pure lack of there being all sorts of other little things that are eating your pages, there's a lot of pages that are
No, that's a selling point. Like, you made 130 pages on this?
It's never like, oh, what if we made 4 pages about banners with pictures of dragons on them as magic items?
No.
Like it's like, no, it's undiluted. It's just these dragons. And then the Jewel of the Indigo Isles is coming soon.
I'm sorry, what?
That is a Jewel of the Indigo Isles. It's a 3-volume adventure in one hardcover with a character guide that's coming out as well, which is a much bigger than a player's guide. There will also be a free player's guide, but it's got like 7 new either ancestries or heritages. The heritages are shorter. There's 5 ancestries and 2 short heritages, and it's got an archetype and some setting information for the default setting, although you can still run this adventure path pretty easily in any setting as just a small island that you add to your home setting.
Because a lot of people are here to hear you and hear your answers, say, what's your personal involvement with all of these products?
Okay, so I am the director of game design at Roll for Combat for the Battle Zoo line. I wasn't when Battle Zoo Bestiary first started out. I did say I wrote the Monster Parts as a freelancer. I wrote most of the Dragon book as a freelancer as well. But like about 80-90% of the way through the Dragon book, I was hired full-time at Roll for Combat. I completed that book, which was, I am the sole author on, although the amazing Ginny D designed, didn't write, but designed the ideas for one of the 45 Dragon heritages that are in the book. It's probably maybe the best one, but was designed by Ginny D. And then starting from that point, as a director of game design, I am focused on the direction of game design decisions for Roll for Combat, and it also means I'm doing a design pass on the mechanics. So everything after the first Battle Zoo Bestiary, where like there was a lot of stuff, that was Patrick Reaney. I don't want to take credit for someone else's good work. He did all those monster development passes. I didn't do anything with those monsters. I did the parts.
So you
everything
do
after that will have a pass from me, and I will make sure that it works.
Including so all the stat blocks, all the content, including the adventures that you described.
Yes, I tried to take a closer look at the adventures to make sure I didn't see any encounters that I thought were like a moose at level 1 that was gonna just like kill your entire party. Which is a luxury that even Paizo doesn't completely have a luxury of letting the designer, who's the design lead on that book, read the entire adventure path. Usually the developer will flag rules sections that need a designer's eye, and you might wind up missing something. Like, I would find things sometimes where it was like, this encounter is off, which I only found because there was an important NPC who was flagged that I needed to check, because they were using a Magus, which was new for that point in time or something like that. And I was like, makes me think there could be other encounters with slight things like that are harder to find. So I went through everything in Jewel of the Indigo Isles.
Great.
And I'm going to continue doing so. We have a new set of products, all of which, except for Battle Zoo Bestiary Strange and Unusual, the next Battle Zoo Bestiary, are secret. And they're going to be announced at PaizoCon. And not only are they going to be announced at PaizoCon, but we also know when at PaizoCon they will be announced, which is, let me get that date and time for you. So,
okay.
Battle Zoo 2022 future product spoilers and Q&A is at 1 p.m. Pacific, Saturday, May 28th. It's going to be online and live at PaizoCon in Cascade Room 3.
And also you have a Twitch channel.
Yes.
And I saw you were reacting to Book of the Dead.
Yes, that's my personal Twitch channel with Linda's Eyes Palmer, is Arcane Mark. And I'm also on Roll for Combat's YouTube channel, which is where I'm with Stephen Glicker. So yeah, we're currently reacting to Book of the Dead. We made it through chapter 1, and we made it up to the undead archetypes in chapter 2.
How actually involved were you in Book of the Dead? Because you're reacting to it. I wonder.
Yeah, well, that's why it's called Biased Reactions.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Have you watched the series? It's called Biased Reactions.
Okay. No. I actually want to see the Book of the Dead.
Linda and I give extremely biased reactions, and I'm one of the listed authors in Book of the Dead. In fact, last on Tuesday, and it's still up on Twitch, that will be the one and only time, because the only things that I directly wrote brand new from scratch for that book were in the part that we did on Tuesday. So I'll pull it out. And when there's a section that is coherently from a single freelancer, and I know who that freelancer is, I'll say who it was as well.
I see.
With Book of the Dead, I have less knowledge because of the fact that Michael Sayer and I were really, really trying to get Guns and Gears out. So there was, to some degree, I did more of a second pass on Book of the Dead than a first, whereas for almost every other book I was on, I did like a ton of first passes on. So because I did a second pass, I got them after another designer, not after the original freelancer, and so I didn't have their name on the document usually.
Okay. Well, I think it's time to wrap up. We did our 2 hours, and I just want to say I really appreciated all of your answers. It was really clear that there was a lot of thought and consideration put into a lot of the problems and challenges of designing the system, Pathfinder. I think I speak on behalf of the viewers in thanking you and the others for making it, and we are having a blast playing it. And
you're welcome.
Yeah, I think also maybe
you said it was okay to get as technical as I wanted to, and 3 viewers said that their head was hurting. So I think we got that I have delivered the thing that you asked for.
Yeah, and they said it hurt in a good way or something, that they were fascinated, which I think is a good result. And
I only got that technical because you specifically said to.
I told you. They
can thank you for that.
Okay. And I think that the fact that, I mean, sometimes it's used as a slur against Pathfinder 2e that it's engineered, and it's something I don't quite understand as a criticism, because to me that just tells me that there was thought and care put into it. And for me, the fact that the encounter building system works and that feats feel like things that are not mandatory, that they're fun options that you can take, it just enhances the quote soft unquote RPG side of the role-playing part of the game. And
as someone with an engineering degree, not literally an engineer since I never went to a job in engineering after my degree. But someone with an engineering degree, I can see why people would use it that way because of the fact that there's kind of a culture of trying to use academia or like trying to use academia or experience or certain degrees of that as a slur. So yeah, I can see why that would happen. Just like in the way of being like, elitist or educated or engineered or things like that.
Well,
I could see any of those happening, but I feel like you want something that's engineered because if you don't, then like on the obviously you could have something that's over engineered. Everyone, including engineers, think that is bad. But you want something that is engineered because if you just let it be whatever it's going to be and you don't think about it, then you're kind of moving more towards something else, which is fine, which is more of just like, well, just play it then, and just kind of have one player be a referee and the other people just say what they do, and you don't need a rule set once you go away from engineering it, right? You could just kind of play make-believe with one person to try to call out what's fair.
So that was it. That's all I have. And
okay.
Yeah.
Well, we made it in about 2 hours, so it worked out.
Okay. Anyway, thanks again, Mark.
You're welcome.
We will. I will end this stream, and we'll continue the chat in the comments, audience. Okay. Thank you, and I will.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Okay.